Why empathy, particularly, uh, what is interesting about it and why that presents a problem?
Right. I think empathy is very critical. I think very important for for the world we live in today in every role that we play in our lives. I think uh, be be it a parent to in our relationships as spouse or fathers, I mean the parents and son, I mean parents and children, and or any kind of relationships. And if you take in a larger scale, a bigger scale, at corporate workhouses, we spend about 10 to 12 hours every day at workplaces, and now of course online, but then in meets and everything else. And empathy, to understand empathy, I think it's really important for all of us, for us to have this dialogue on what is empathy, and what is empathy, and what does it mean in the world today, where everything is changing at such a fast pace. Uh, in the last 6 months itself, everything, I mean, last 3 to 4 months, most of it has come up in the air. When, I mean, in terms of chasing numbers, in terms of really having that very focused effort only on chasing numbers as someone who's managing a team, to taking care of employees. Now for us, now at this point in time, I mean, all the business models is up in the air now. What works, where do we stand, what is the so for us, I think empathy, understanding empathy is very critical. My understanding of empathy is just not about being goody goody, being nice, just having an aerostar smile,
So
or
not just a kind of
yeah.
not just talking the talk. It's also implementing it in one's own life. So it's not
Yeah.
simply a kind of a facade of niceness or saying the right things or something like that.
Right.
Why won't that work? Why isn't empathy simply? Why can't we simply say, let's be nice to each other? Why won't that work?
No, I think it's a good time to invest on relationships. I think it's a good time to understand how this really works. What's a sustained change? What's sustained success? Um, what, these critical aspects, which is driven by relationships. I mean, performance. Now, for example, if you look at performance at workplace, now I've had this. I mean, I have a manufacturing company. I have about 30 people working in the company. So we often kind of discuss, and I often think about this, and how do you manage people, how do you really lead a bunch of people. Now for me, it is, what I've realized is, it is important for us to be authentic and real and natural with our presence, with not approach, not getting into the company saying I'm the boss now. I'm going to tell people what needs to be done. I'm going to tell them what it's really moving away from that space to just absorbing everything that is going on. And really about, one important thing I think about empathy is also about validating their thoughts, validating their ideas,
Mm.
and which gives a great space for magic to happen, which gives a great, that's when this moment becomes very exciting, is what I feel, which is missing in many places. So
So why do you think it is missing? Why do people? I mean, let's just limit ourselves to
yeah,
the
yeah,
workplace, and let's also limit ourselves to the context in India
right,
that you're more familiar with.
right.
Why do people fail to be empathetic? Bosses or whoever managers. What might be at least two reasons, let's say, that people fail to be empathetic?
I think one main reason is the lack of awareness. I think the lack of awareness of what do one need to do. I mean, lack of social awareness. What is it? How does this work? How do minds work? I mean, when you're talking about managing a bunch of people, it is, I mean, you're wanting to kind of influence them on a day-to-day basis. You have to kind of go out there, inspire them, motivate them, get them focused, get them to hit the numbers. But what's the interesting thing is, if you can't manage your own mind, what game are we really playing? So empathy, that's how empathy really starts with you. It for me it starts with me because this is the only formula that will work. This is the only formula that will work, because it is not uh, it is not very superficial. It's application of empathy is not superficial. It is it comes from a mature mind. It comes from a sensitive mind. I think empathy comes from all of this. I mean, these factors of kindness or compassion or anything of that kind,
But
which are qualities of empathy.
what
Yeah.
do you think is only a lack of awareness? Sometimes even being aware, uh, the the situation or the system in which you find yourself in might prevent one from implementing that awareness or acting on that awareness, at least in a consistent manner, because they might fear losing their job or fear coming across as a crazy person
Right.
to other people.
Right.
So that's something I think is interesting to
Yeah.
talk about. I mean, we can come back to that later, but something to think about. I mean, finally, what have you seen as some problematic consequences of this failure to be empathetic in the workplace?
Right.
How does this affect the stated goals
Right.
the typically stated goals of
Right.
the corporate establishment, or other goals that might this failure might affect?
Right. I think like it can really bring about you know when we talk about success again, we need to define success. What does success really mean? How does that look like? If it is about reaching a number in a month's time and we have to chase, well, you have to chase, and it's a short term goal. You have to hit the number. You can't do anything about it. You cannot really be cognitive about people's feelings, people's emotions, or anything of that kind. You have to ignore. You have to chase the numbers. But for a long term success, if you're trying to build a team, if you're leading if you're leading a bunch of people, then I think that again edges towards leadership and management, and how leaders and managers, what's the difference between the two, and things like that. And you really don't need a role to lead. And I think and you can really inspire people by being empathic, by being true to those values that you stand by, not just chase and continue that journey by creating a political environment, by getting into sides, making your own teams and then conspiring against the others and things like that. But instead, possibly being very real about each communication that you have. I think it's very important, this in the corporate world, across the world where I've taken workshops. I think this seems to be the pain area um, where people build cases against each other or something of that kind, where it's not the intention of uh, uh, the action. The intention of the action is not to take care of the other person, not to not with the hope that they develop, or not with the hope that they build their understanding, but just with the hope of getting my word done. So the game changes now suddenly. The game of, let us understand, let's build something beautiful together, to it's my way or the highway. Or if you don't listen to me, then I'm going to talk to two of my other friends who are influencers and make sure we get to you, or something of that kind. So now a different game starts altogether. Now my only way of survival at this point then would be to build my own team as well. So in the midst of this, we possibly get lost when it comes to the goal of it all. I found myself in a lot of these situations in the corporate world, because obviously I wasn't ready with this. When we come out of engineering, you have a fresh perspective of what life could be, or a bunch of people, corporate world, whatever it is. But then suddenly it's a different. it's a different ball game. It's a different mask you have to wear. So, but over the years, what I've seen is this really works. That you got to be authentic. You don't need to convince everyone. You don't need to please everyone, but you can build a small corner in the office where you can possibly have a bunch of people whom you can add value to, whose life you can add value to, and just move on. And by this, I've seen you're able to kind of inspire more and more people, and you create a very healthy atmosphere in the.
Have you seen that already happening in your experience to a certain extent? In
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it does. I think it does. However, one has to be very consistent with it, with the application. One has to be consistent. I mean, it has become an application, but it's just about being real. It's about being authentic, and it's about consistently showing these values again and again, and putting yourself out there. How successful it is, it's still out there. I mean, it depends on so many other factors. I feel it depends on the environment, the environment of the company. It depends on what the focus area of the company is, and what do they how do they treasure their employees. What are the I mean, so many other things. I mean, so many other policies that the company stands on. But you can still keep building that smaller group, make it a bigger group, whatever it is. I mean, you still you don't need to look for the entire company to kind of make a to kind of make a change. But understanding empathy is very critical, I think, before anything can happen. What does empathy mean? I mean, one of the qualities of empathy is listening, for example. I mean, ability to listen and really not being too judging about it. Ability to listen, to just pause, to kind of be in that space. I think validation is so critical in everything. I think, and that itself creates a very healthy environment uh, for connection to happen, to relationships to build. What I've seen as a consequence of this is people extend themselves more when it comes to teamwork. People make themselves more and more available.
so,
People,
so
yeah,
you're saying then that furthering empathy would actually lead to uh, would lead to the meeting of the stated goals of the corporate unit, whatever typically that being sales or numbers or profit margin or whatever. It helps them reach those very goals in a more consistent and successful manner, on the one hand, and also an effect of that would be to retain employee commitment
yeah,
to the firm, instead
mm,
of them having to replace employees constantly, which would again take up a lot of money and resources.
right.
But is there a way to think about empathy as, at some level, perhaps even coming to conflict with these kinds of notions of um, um, I mean, does empathy and things like profit or sales and so on, do they always need to uh, go hand in hand? Will they be in conflict at some level, such that and which partly explains why traditionally things like empathy um, have been seen as a distraction, as a waste of time, or even antithetic to the stated goals of the firm. So how are we so sure that they can always nicely work together, empathy and these kinds of numbers and sales goals of the firm?
Right. So, I mean, look, I think one of the pillars on which the success of a company rests on is the ownership that the employees take in the company. You know, how responsible do they feel towards the goal of a company? Now, this is the same everywhere. I think your success in studies depend on how well you own your own studies, you own your own results. Now, when it comes to the company, if the employees are not really owning the results, then you need to come out with strategies and policies to ensure they keep the focus on, to keep the to make sure you know make sure you focus on numbers more and more. Of course, numbers are important. Of course, all of that is important. But I mean, forgetting the humaneness of this all is going to be going to be hugely deterrent for a sustained success, I think, because um, again, if it's a short-term success, it's okay, but you would want to build your company on reliable people. You want to build company on people who stay with you for a long time, not as someone who would do 2 years so that they get another job, because 2 years is a good time to spend in the company, you know. So uh, for one to build that kind of a space, very important to be emotionally intelligent. To, I mean, emotionally intelligent is, again, it seems very technical and strategic word in itself, I think. But you know, when you're relaxed and natural, and this is one of the questions I had as well. I keep thinking, is empathy something which is that is not natural, or is it a natural thing to have, or is it something that people exhibit easily, or is it something that we need to kind of learn as a skill? What do you think?
I mean, I think, I don't think, um, I don't think people are simply born with empathy or not born with empathy. It can be clearly an acquired skill, but that doesn't mean that it can be acquired once and for all very quickly.
Yeah,
You need to work on it your whole life, because, there might be situations in your life where you're constantly, I mean, there
yeah,
are situations in your life where you're constantly tested as to what
yeah,
empathy might mean in that situation. And
right,
you need to improvise, you need to understand. Um, the situation more, understand yourself more, and therefore try to dig in deeper, depending on what the situation is. So for example, if if there's an earthquake or something like that happening, and the first thing someone might think about is themselves and their family. They're not necessarily empathetic about what the neighbor's furniture is doing in this their costly furniture is doing in this earthquake.
right,
So there's all kinds of situations when it's not always possible for people to think about everyone else, and not even think about themselves in any kind of um, sophisticated or concerned manner. So I think that it's a definitely an acquired skill, and by acquired skill I mean, things like even the kinds of experiences one might have had in their childhood, the kinds of experience in education that they might have had, what kinds of role models they might have encountered, what kinds of people they might have looked up to in their life. So all of those things play a big role. There's also the a big factor is one's culture one finds oneself in, how that reinforces these kinds of values, or are we reducing all kinds of human interactions to merely profit margin and numbers? Uh, and generally, I think in our society today, globally, if I may say so, there is a tendency towards reduction of all kinds of human relationships to monetary relationships. And so I think that is those kinds of things affect the individual when they are growing up in that culture, in a particular family, in a particular educational setup. So you can empathy is an acquired skill, but empathy is also, um, I think, destroyed or compromised based on the environment one grows up in. So the same factors which help one acquire empathy could also sort of undermine the development of empathy. So I don't think it's a simple process at all. Um, but at the same time, I don't think there's any point in saying it's natural or not natural. I think that uh, most things in life are somewhere in, kind of most things are acquired. Some, nature, of course. By nature, I mean something like genetics. I don't know what we mean by nature in this context. Genetics could affect one's disposition towards certain things, but there's also a whole field called epigenetics, which basically studies the impact of environment on genes and the way biologically how it affects the organism. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. Yeah.
I think more apt question then would be are children more empathic in nature? Are all children more empathic in nature? Or the days when you have had a good night's sleep, are you more empathic than the days when you're put under pressure? Or when you feel someone has done something to you which is not right, and
Right.
it's tough to exhibit empathy in those times,
Yeah.
especially then when you're very relaxed and stress free. Or for children, for example, are they empathic in nature?
I don't think, I don't think children are, I think, I wouldn't say that they are, again, naturally empathetic or not, but I definitely think that it's easier to teach a child how to be empathetic by modeling that behavior yourself as a parent or a caretaker.
Mm,
So then to a 35-year-old adult who might not uh, uh, learn from the parent so quickly.
right.
So it's but I still think that it's an acquired trait. It's an acquired ability. You don't simply children are, like small children, for example, when um, sometimes don't know how to react in a given situation, and when they see an adult showing empathy or care, they learn from that,
Mm,
and yeah, and of course, stress and all those things do play a big role in in one's ability to display empathy. That's why I say I think there's several things we can kind of differentiate here. There's an awareness of what empathy might be, an ability, that's one, and second one, an ability to kind of display empathy in real life situations, which goes beyond mere awareness. Um, and three, an ability to do that consistently
mm,
in all of one's relationships or most of one's relationships as much as possible. There could be off days, of course, where one is not able to do that. But still, if that awareness and ability is there, one can try and um, and display empathy when they don't have those off days. But at the same time, I think that there are several things, just like not getting a good night's sleep. There's also the work environment and the particular configuration of the firm or the corporate setup in which one is working. If uh, if the environment is hostile to emotional intelligence or empathy or undermines those things, it might be tough for someone to keep that up as the sole kind of warrior who's trying to do this. And they might look a bit out of place. So I think that my point here is that it's not simply an individual's ability. Uh, so it goes back to the previous question, whether empathy is an acquired skill. The answer is yes, but I would also say empathy is also depends the development of the empathy depends on one's environment, but also the maintenance of empathy as a skill that one brings into play in different situations in one's life also depends on one's environment. Uh, so it's not that we simply develop it and then we somehow uh, transcend the factors in one's environment, in one's culture, so to speak, and can simply float above it. I mean, maybe some exceptional folks can do that, but I think that for a lot of people, the environment in which they are brought up or environment in which they work uh, put a lot of or are important factors in one's ability to develop empathy as a skill, but also to maintain it, to further develop it, depending on the kinds of situation they find themselves in. So I think that environment plays a big role, both in
Right.
the acquisition and the maintenance, and the
Right.
honing of that skill. Yeah.
Right. If I find myself in a situation like that, if I find myself in a in an environment which is not really encouraging, what do I do? Where do I start? How do I build these skills? Or do I even venture about building these skills, or just go for
What kind of environment? I mean, are you talking about corporate environment in
any environment, maybe corporate or at home, where your empathy, where your ability to express or show your empathy doesn't come up so easily, then what do I do? I mean, well, one of the things that comes to my mind immediately when I'm saying that is to kind of work on yourself. I think constantly kind of work on yourself, on your thinking, on on. I mean, thinking about thinking is very very critical. I think the sharpness of the thoughts can possibly ha- help build better emotions, help exhibit better emotions. So I think as some thoughts, some school of thoughts say emotions and logic or emotions or thinking are actually opposing each other, but in fact they might just be adding value to each other. I think finer emotions can lead to better thinking, and sharper thoughts can lead to better healthier emotions as well. I think I mean, that's one of the things that I usually focus on in my coaching sessions as well, to try and build better thinking patterns.
No,
uh,
I do right. That's there, but I think that, um, I mean, I think to be so going back to your question, how do you display empathy if the situation is hostile to it or something like that? And no matter, we can talk about different kinds of situations. I mean, it goes back to, I think, an essential aspect of empathy. I think empathy is it it is understood typically as an other-oriented um, emotional ability. That is, you're basically trying to look at things from someone else's perspective. Um, but I think to be able to do that, there are several demands on oneself um, to be able to do that successfully. So the development of empathy would involve, I would say, first a kind of a self understanding, a self regard. In some ways, if you can use that term, a kind of a self empathy. That is understanding one's own emotional makeup, one's own strengths and weaknesses as it pertains to a given situation. Um, so I think that empathy in that sense involves a kind of a self-awareness, which would lead to an awareness of others' situation, others' point of view, others' condition. Um, I don't think we can get there before, at least not in a consistent manner. And that's when we get to, we end up with these kinds of performative aspects of empathy that is kind of vacuous inside. Performative in the sense that you simply, talking the talk, but you're not really doing it because in some ways, doing that self-regard, the self-care, the self understanding is in a way it revitalizes your own self. You're at some level you derive a kind of an enjoyment from that, a kind of uh, appreciation for that. uh, and so because usually I think when people hear the word empathy, they simply hear this kind of some kind of older grandparents preachy thing that you should be nice to others. So they sort of might agree that that should be the case, but they don't quite see why they should be nice to others,
yeah.
because their livelihood depends on them making this money and getting ahead in the situation that they're in. Why are they supposed to be nice to others? So it seems to be a kind of arbitrary moral demand on oneself, that they simply need to play this nice role. So, and from that point of view, if you understand empathy in that way, it's understandable that you cannot keep that up, or you might say this is not essential, or it's a distraction, that is understandable why one might think that way. Uh,
Right.
but if you understand empathy as primarily a self-oriented skill, uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
something that kind of revitalizes, kind of orients oneself towards oneself, towards one's own um, strengths and weaknesses, one's own emotional and intellectual needs. Uh, and once one gets, and this is a complex process, of course, and because all of these strengths and weaknesses and so on, the assessment of that happens in the not in one's room in some kind of private setting usually, but usually in the context of living amongst other people, and
Right.
navigating the complex world. So that's why it's a skill that is acquired through the navigation of one's own environment. Once one is able to do that, then the demand, I think, becomes the second level of demand is to be able to uh, be honest to oneself, to true to oneself, in um, uh, encountering different situations. This might mean putting the foot down and saying, enough is enough. I'm not going to do that, or stating one's own values about different things, about how one balances the desire to make money, the desire to get ahead um, in one's work, the desire for success, with also one's own emotional requirements and emotional demands oneself. So it is really, at some level, being true to oneself, and how one balances that. If one is not paying attention to that, then definitely not going to pay attention to that with someone else. You're not going to do
Exactly.
that. You know,
Exactly.
I've not done it to myself. Why am I going to do it to others? So the empathy, therefore, cannot be simply, please do it to others. It cannot be simply a pleading that one has to do it to others, because that sounds absurd, and
Yeah.
understandably so. Um, so and so first is, I would say, self understanding and self awareness. Two is this kind of second level, is this kind of honesty, or being truthful to oneself in different social situations. Uh, that is the second level. In that sense, is still kind of self oriented. It is still shows a regard for oneself, but more in the context, explicitly in the context of different environments. Um,
How
so
you manage yourself in different environments,
how you
how
present
you,
yourself, right?
how you project yourself into the world, and
Right.
or even though you're put under pressure at times, even though you
Yeah.
know this is such a critical skill, I think, for
Yeah.
every level in the organization, for each bunch of 8 years of our lives itself,
Right.
from possibly
Right.
8 years or 10 years on.
Right. So, for example, if you are presented yourself in a kind of a relationship,
Right.
either boss worker relationship, or even uh, a spousal relationship, or something like that. uh, you if the other person is not showing regard to you, or not understanding you, or there's a big misunderstanding, of course one has to learn to be patient, and study the situation. So patience is a part of this kind of understanding the situation, understanding oneself with respect to the situation. um, but at some point you would have to come clean and say, look, this is not working for me. What is going on? So and that is a moment of honesty. That's a moment of truth telling, of being true to oneself, where you say, this is not working for me, or this is not what I expected from this situation. And that is not necessarily an affront to the other person. It's primarily, it could be, unfortunately, taken as an affront to them, by them, but it's primarily a sticking up for oneself. It's primarily a regard for oneself. So you kind of, at that, I mean, you can even understand this as drawing a limit, uh, drawing a limit to um, one's flexibilities given a situation, and that drawing of that limit presupposes a kind of a relatively clear understanding of one's own strengths and limits, uh,
Oh,
strengths and
this
negatives.
takes to the next third stage, which is about, okay, now you understand your limits. Now, how are you going to really project yourself out there?
Right.
Will you really project yourself with complete disregard with the people around you, or still kind of balance this out in a
It's
way?
definitely balancing. We're definitely balancing. But I think that once you are more comfortable in your own skin, once you're comfortable in understanding yourself, then
Right,
you're, I think, ready to take the third step, which is definitely the more other orientation happens at this time, where so it's a movement from self to the other. The other orientation happens at this time, where things like listening, things like vulnerability, things like risk taking, uh, kind of an open-endedness to different situations, and that's what typically I think people understand by empathy, that you are presenting yourself um, in a vulnerable manner to different situations, that you are not simply cut off from different experiences. You're letting the other be what they are,
right, right.
letting them present to the situation as what they are.
Now,
Um,
now, now. So, how about? I mean, what if we do the third step of really learning how to kind of say the right things at the right time, but not really do the first two of managing yourself, or kind of understand your trigger points, understand what really works for you, what are your interests, where how do you really need to react to situations and people,
mhm.
and what happens internally, what is the roller coaster that's going on
Yeah.
inside. If we really don't kind of figure that out and go for the third one, the third step, it looks like an accident waiting to happen. So,
Right. I mean, you're not actually doing the third step. I mean, you're
right.
simply doing a kind of
Yeah.
facade
Yeah.
of the third step. It's like asking someone to asking someone to coach a team when they don't
Right.
know what that game is for themselves.
Right.
they're not gonna coach. They might say a lot of things which appear on the outside to be the right things to say. For example, hey, train hard or something like that. But it might not actually. The other person will not buy it. They will see through this fakeness. But anyway, I mean, I think there's several things to be said about this third thing. I think it that and but you're right regarding that point, that when you move on to the third level, you don't abandon the first and the second. You take that
Right.
with you. There is
Right.
still a self-regard. There's still a self-orientation.
I think this is a point where there is a lot of gap in the world, in the corporate world, especially because one kind of learns as you go in managerial programs or managerial trainings, or possibly seeing your own managers at action do these things where you say that you don't say these things, you don't do those things, you say these at these times, and
Mhm.
without really understanding or presenting yourself into the picture. So even if you're taken out of that picture,
Right.
it really doesn't matter.
Right.
Your exit really didn't matter.
I mean, if I can put it this way, I mean, just something occurred to me here. If I can put it this way, I think that in a kind of a work office corporate setup, I think that there is an interesting kind of dynamic with
Mm,
respect to these three levels. There's an interesting dynamic with regard to the individual employee
mm,
and the firm, the corporate at large, or the manager managing the employee. I think the responsibility of the corporate is to create the environment, create, I mean, in some small way. They cannot create the whole society for them, of course. To create the environment for the individual employee to be able to perform for themselves stages
right,
one and two. Stages
right.
one and two, where they understand their strengths and limitations. They find for themselves their place within the organizational setup of that firm, such that they can articulate for themselves their strengths and weaknesses.
Mm,
They can therefore articulate to someone else what they're willing to perform, uh, what kind of extra mile are they willing to go, when they've hit their limit, and so on. And then, so that is what the firm provides for the employee. And the third stage is what the employee provides for the firm. That's when they essentially, at this point, say, okay, now it's for me to be open to, now it's time for me to be a team player. Time for me to bring out the best in other employees.
Right.
Maybe even sometimes, perform, maybe work on the weekends because we have to meet that goal for the firm. They'll be able to do that because they're already sort of affirmed in their abilities at that first two levels. I mean, you kind of see this, in parenting as well. You
Right.
need to sort of strengthen the conviction of the child,
Mm.
and make them feel secure in themselves about their own abilities. Then they will go the extra mile for you, right?
Mm.
And then they will say, for example, you take them on a road trip and you say, okay, we have to sit in car for 3 more hours because
Right.
our home is not here yet.
Right.
And the child will say, okay, I guess you've been nice to me in the morning. I will sit for 3 more hours. If you just sit for 3 more hours without doing the initial step, they're going to cry. I speak from personal experience. Anyway, yeah.
No, it's true. It's true. But what's also interesting is now how you really, the third part of how you really present yourself out there also demands a certain understanding of what's out there and how this works.
Right.
And I feel that is a reflection of the first and the second step.
Hmm. Right. Exactly.
So
Yeah.
if you're able to understand this thing very well, if you're able
Yeah.
to understand how this, why you're thinking the way you're thinking, or understand these trigger points, understand all of these things,
Yeah.
your ability to understand the world around you
Or to
improves.
put it in other terms, I mean, you can think of this in some kind of interesting play between um, um, context or environment and the subject. I think at the first two levels,
Mm.
the um, organizational setup, the
Mm.
hierarchies and the work culture and so on, provide the context for
Mm.
the individual employee, for the individual subject, to define their own strengths and limitations. Um,
Right,
at the third level, uh, the they become um, not the sort of the subject on which the environment operates on, but rather the subject which operates on the environment. They,
right,
they are now therefore oriented towards the outside.
right,
So the first two levels, the orientation is from the outside environment towards the subject. The third level, from the subject towards the outward environment. So there's this kind of symbiotic relationship.
yeah, yeah,
There.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, totally. I think it's so critical. This is this chemistry, this whole equation is so critical in the success of any smaller teams and then the company at
Yeah.
large.
And I would even say, this is a constant feedback loop. So
Right.
so you don't simply often, there is uh, after this third level of orientation towards the other, there might be constant need to come back to the first level and
Mm.
do that work on oneself. This is what I meant earlier by this is uh, empathy is something that you have to constantly work on. It's not simply a kind of just, okay, we're done with the third level, we're done now.
Got
Uh,
it. Let's move
because
on.
I think what happens is at third level, because that even at third level, what you're doing is walking this kind of very difficult and thin line between regarding oneself and regarding for having regard for the other.
Right.
And you might get it wrong several times, and so you learn from that process. Then you go back um, within oneself and understand the same, take that experience with you, and kind of teach yourself what this could mean. So it's a lot of trial and error process. I mean, it's like any. I mean, I can compare this to sports. If you take Sachin Tendulkar as the great batsman of the previous era, or Kohli now. So it's not like they just know what's the best way to bat, and that's it. So they of course know a lot. They've practiced a lot, and then they're ready to go play the match, and that's like the third level. They're
Right.
they're willing to show what they've learned. But then sometimes it doesn't work. We know Tendulkar struggled against McGrath several times, and then he'll go back and he will
Right.
work in the practice nets. That's going
Right.
back to the first level again, and he will try to play that little outswing from McGrath, and how to hit
Instructor was always a challenge, by the way. But
that.
yeah, so that's interesting. It's a loop, and sometimes it's tougher to kind of handle your own mind in the midst of it, because we tend to give ourselves reasons of why people are like that, and come
Right.
out. The perception because you're in the midst of things, and the pressure is so much.
Hmm.
Now you wouldn't want to be critical on yourself as well, because the whole world is critical already. So if you're not strongly rooted in your own belief systems and your own understanding of yourself, it's easy to get wayward.
Right.
I think that's where
Right.
you probably need someone
No,
to
I think that this is why this point for this process to work. I think, I mean, in one's entire life, but definitely also in the smaller context of a corporate setup, you need role models, you need managers, you need those higher up in the order to help uh,
reflect
employees,
these
individual
values.
employees.
Right.
Just like a coach might help Tendulkar to say, no, that's what was going on. No matter how further along he is in his career, he might need that kind of sharp eyes to kind of, encourage him and bring him back to that level. So
Right.
in some sense, we never in that way stop being children. We need someone else at some points to kind of guide us and bring us back to the drawing board.
Right.
Um, but one thing I wanted to add, is just I kind of forgot about it, is that I think that in the first two levels, that is this kind of self-understanding. Again, to recall, first understanding, self-understanding is the first level, and this kind of um, um, truthfulness about oneself in the context of a situation is the second level. For both of these two, particularly for the first level, I think a lot of the things that we talked about with regard to the third level, vulnerability, open-endedness, risk-taking, listening, um, are also happening at the first level, but with regard to oneself. One is
Yes.
listening,
Yes.
one
Yes.
is listening to oneself,
Exactly.
one is
Exactly.
taking risk with regard to oneself. So that skill that you employ and learn with regard to yourself is what you bring in your interaction with the other.
Right.
It cannot be a magical skill that comes out of nowhere.
Right. Totally. Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, so I think empathy in a complex environment where there are so many other factors that define you, like not just your own thinking. I know that in the West there is an individualism that exists. I am my own person. I am my own thought. So I'm my own existence. I live. But I think in the Eastern, and especially in India, I think the culture plays such a strong context. I think, uh, uh, like I was doing a small program or set of programs for the leading MNC in India, where one of the challenges the company had was that the women leaders wouldn't express their points of views in the meet would express the points of views in the meet after all the people have spoken, or after all the male counterparts have
Mm.
actually expressed their opinions and things like that. So they would see, or sometimes they would hold themselves back. They would kind of bring that back, hold themselves back. So it becomes it kind of, although things are changing rapidly right now, there is that culture aspect, even in places like China or Japan, for example, or any other. I mean, even in Philippines, when I take my sessions, when I do my coaching or my training sessions here, I've seen that there is this tendency where people hold themselves back a little bit more. This ability to not be out there, not be too vocal, not to express your points of views up front,
Hmm.
and wait and add that emotional touch, spin to many things,
Hmm.
to things more than. So your understanding of yourself then becomes a complex matter. Then it becomes your understanding of self in in the midst, or in how you react to the culture, or what you understand of the culture around you,
Hmm.
what you think then you could push, and what you think that you could pull
Hmm.
in that context could
Yeah.
all will also
So,
create a complex environment, a complex thought
yeah.
there.
So what's your question with regard to that?
Now, how, I mean, when you talk about self-awareness, then it becomes a more, the understanding of oneself will become
Right.
a lot more, I think. Just a thought. I mean, uh,
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think in generally, I think that's a complex phenomenon, what's going on in a lot of non-Western countries. Um, they are non-Western, but I have noted that a lot of the corporate culture is similar to the kind of capitalist profit-driven corporate cultures here. Uh, so what's going, I mean, this is a wholly different issue, and I don't think that we can kind of do justice to this in this discussion. But I think that what's going on in countries like India, China, Philippines, and so on is this kind of, they have their traditional cultures, and with that, different understandings of relationships, of different understandings of dynamics between men and women, between superiors, elders, and juniors or younger people. Um, that generally is not what I witnessed, is not clearly or more aggressively evident in America. I think the gender thing still happens here, more so than people might think. Definitely not the elder or younger thing. There is no respect for elders, particularly here. But definitely the somewhat of the man woman dynamic. But I clearly see that is much more prevalent in countries like India. But what is interesting is that that level of cultural uh, understanding, cultural mores, which is already kind of difficult to deal with, is then kind of superimposed by this kind of corporate profit-driven culture, which is I think to a large extent imported from America and countries in Europe. Uh, so I think what countries like India face is this very complex layering of different cultural influences. So you have on the one hand success, profit-driven value, which doesn't really see or tends not to see human values or human needs. But there's also this kind of human element to it, which is the more traditional Indian cultural element, which carries itself over to the workplace, and this extremely complicates the situation extremely in extreme ways that might present great difficulties for individual employees to navigate both those levels of cultural influence. So there is no easy answer to that. What I can
It's a
say,
constant work, in a way. It's a constant work to kind of get it finer, get it
right?
better, and it's very individualistic. It's very subjective in many ways. So it's about each person's ability to manage this and kind of penetrate through this and come out with their version of it. I
Yeah,
think
and it's
that
pretty
should be
difficult. It's pretty difficult. But I know it's individual. I mean, by individual we really mean at what we talked about as the first level of
right,
self care. That's what I want to understand here as the individual kind
right,
of self regard. Um, but as we noted in that discussion a few minutes ago, that happens in the context of other people, in the context of the environment. So the environment, if it's multi-layered in this way, it does present a complex situation for the individual. They're supposed to be playing this role as a man or a woman, but they're also supposed to be playing this role as a junior or senior person in the corporate setup. They're also playing this role as someone who's supposed to work their hardest in order to increase the numbers or sales or something like that. So all of those things are presented to them as these different demands, environmental demands, on their individual self. How then does one understand one's strengths, weaknesses in that context? How does one understand? How does one stick up for oneself? How does one be truthful to oneself? I think it's a very difficult question, and on that level, I think that the typical work environment in India is a lot more complex than here, where some of those cultural factors are not as strongly evident as it is here as it is in India. But I've seen it's hard enough here for employees to stick up for themselves. So
right.
I can understand that's a pretty difficult thing to do. Yeah.
Right. I mean, what I take back is also one aspect which comes through as a consistent thing is to kind of consistently kind of go back to the first level, to kind of go back and reanalyze and re-strategize and re-understand yourself, and re-understand yourself in the new situation that you are right now.
Yeah.
Re-understand your trigger points, re-understand your own perception of what
Yeah.
is right, what is wrong.
I mean,
Yeah,
I think that something occurred to me. I think that, the maybe the advantage, the relative advantage that um, Indian culture in this regard presents is that on the one hand, you have this multi-layered um, cultural influences. On the other hand, I think that Indian society, as you mentioned, is not individualistic. There are stronger, for example, stronger family values than here. I mean, I'm just kind of thinking about this as we go along. So in that sense, the individual can derive strength and maybe comfort or encouragement from different venues in coping with their particular work environment situation, maybe from
mm,
their family, maybe from
true,
a
true that.
stronger setup. I mean, India also has, I mean, you know, um, a very rich spiritual tradition of meditation and yoga and things like places like art of living and so on are sources of that kind of potential strength for the individual, or potential places for individual to work on themselves, so to speak, which is, comparatively speaking, not that prevalent here. Here, I think individualism tends to border on isolation
Right.
and
And
alienation
depression.
from
Yeah,
from
and
community.
depression.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, it's a complex matter.
Yeah. So
But
that doesn't mean that it's easy in India, but I'm just saying that is a relative kind of advantage, maybe. Yeah.
yeah, I think each one has something going for it, and each one has something going against it in a way as well. So, uh, but going back to the source is very important. I think that really helps one get a different perspective, different
Mhm.
version of reality, a different version of how to tackle things. So, yeah.